Hello, I'm Professor G and welcome to the channel. Now for today's lesson, I have to warn you that we're going to discuss things that can be very disturbing, such as suicide and death. So if that is something that triggers you, I encourage you to maybe step back and not watch this lesson because this is going to be very troubling, and this just helps to again show you how the antebellum South, the slaveholding states, was not simply a society with slaves, but it was a slaveocracy. That the system of African slavery was the foundation for the society of the antebellum South. Everything revolved around it. And today's case, we're going to look at a case from Louisiana. That's where I'm actually living. That's where I've lived for the last 20 years. And I just recently had a piece published in a law review about the Louisiana Civil Code and slavery. So this comes from that article that I've written. And it's disturbing because it's going to show you how the courts tap danced around the personhood of enslaved individuals and consider them, for the most part, to be property, and property for the benefit of a master. And that when they did express these moments of humanity, as people do, the courts had a very difficult time trying to dance around that in order to protect the rights of the masters, the enslavers, the slave sellers, all the people involved in the institution of slavery. So to understand this case, you have to understand a little bit about Louisiana law and something called redhibitory defects. Redhibitory defect it still exists today. It's this idea that if you buy something and it has one of these defects, that had you have known about the defect, you absolutely would not have bought it, or you would have paid substantially less for it. And a redhibitory defect has to be something that renders it almost useless for the purpose for which you bought this object, this said thing, right? So it can't do what you bought it to do, and if you would have known about this, you wouldn't have bought it at all, or you would have paid exponentially less for it if you still wanted to buy something. So in this case, we're dealing with, and again, this is where it's going to get difficult for many of you. So again, if you need to step back, I don't see far be it for me to say don't watch my video lessons, but this is one of those where you have to be very careful. So a slave dealer had sold to another enslaver a African woman and her child, and he bought them as slaves. Before they could be delivered to the new enslaver, the woman ran off with her child and drowned both herself and her child. And the enslaver, the plantation owner, then refused to pay. Right? He said, "You never delivered my product to me," an enslaved mother and her child, "therefore I'm not paying for it." So the slave dealer sued, right? And what this came down to was an argument over redhibitory defect. The man who refused to pay said, clearly these slaves were insane, right? Or at least the mother was insane, because how on earth would a sane person drown themselves and their child? Therefore, I shouldn't have to pay. And the court looked at this and came to a very disturbing decision. They ended up saying that the act itself seemed a little insane. But other than that act, there was nothing to go against this enslaved woman not having good sense. So pretty much what they said is, yeah, this act of her drowning herself and her child seemed a little off. But there was nothing else in the record to rebut the presumption of her good sense, her sanity. So therefore, you do owe this person money, right? The slave was not insane. There was no redhibitory defect. The problem is, if you look at this reasoning, this holding for what it is, it's actually really disturbing. Because since the court found no evidence of madness, that this woman wasn't insane, then it could only be seen as a tragic, desperate attempt to escape slavery. So, by the court refusing to classify the drowning as insanity, the court, in its decision, inadvertently conceded the unbearable reality of slavery. Right? Do you see the problem here? the court in effect said that because it's so dehumanizing, it's so it's so against what people can stand, what people want, any sort of system anyone wants to be involved in, that killing yourself and even killing your child could actually appear to be a sane, logical, reasonable response to the alternative of being enslaved, right? So even though the court did hint at the fact that this act seemed off, well, she's clearly not, regardless, she's not insane. Okay, well, if she's not insane, then even though this act seems off, this act seems to go against what we consider to be good sense. If she's not insane, then she made a rational, conscious decision to kill herself and her child by drowning herself and drowning her, which is a horrific thing to think of. She drowned her child, then she drowned herself in order to avoid remaining enslaved or being sold to this other person and being enslaved by him. So, do you see how crazy this actually is? In this situation, this court acknowledged that killing yourself and your child could technically be a reasonable response to not wanting to be enslaved. By the way, this isn't the first or the last time we will see people actually do this in response to being enslaved. In another Louisiana case, there was an enslaved woman who was beaten violently multiple times. I believe 2 times she was actually beaten, whipped, because the overseer had accused her of stealing something. He then said he was going to beat her again. And I'll cite the case in the description of this video. And before she could be beaten again, she actually asked him, I'll go get what you said I stole. Just please don't beat me again. If you don't beat me, I'll go get the stolen item. He agreed. He let her go, and she went and drowned herself. Because clearly she didn't actually steal anything. And she was so afraid of going back to being beaten again that the alternative was death for her. That was a better alternative for her. In this case, a little bit different. It wasn't dealing with insanity. It was dealing with the power of someone over an enslaved individual. And to make a long story short with this one, the owner actually sued the overseer, saying, you're the reason my slave died. I deserve compensation for this. And the court looked at it and said, there's nothing on the record to show that the beatings themselves caused the slave's death. The beatings themselves seem to be reasonable, rational, normal beatings that are given to enslaved individuals. She went and killed herself, and we see no direct connection between the actual beating and the death of the slave. So, do you see how disturbing that is? Now, while this went against the master in that case, what it did was it reaffirmed that severe beatings were considered normal in the antebellum South, especially in antebellum Louisiana, when it came to disciplining or doing something to your slaves, because the beatings were not considered the reason for this woman going off to drown herself, when clearly they were, and the beatings were considered normal, and the beatings were considered something that an overseer, an owner of an enslaved individual, and thereby anyone they put in charge of their enslaved individuals could have that authority to do things like mercilessly beat them for the most part. And in future lessons, I will talk about how laws that were meant or that on their face seemed to protect enslaved individuals actually did nothing of the sort when they were interpreted by the courts. Because very rarely in the antebellum South did courts go so far as to say what type of punishment is extreme or outrageous. They would, again, as I've said in the beginning of this video, tap dance around things like that. So again, another very disturbing thing to see. So again, I know this lesson was difficult. It's one of the first difficult ones that we've done. But it is important to show you how the courts often had to wrestle with this idea of the human side of enslaved individuals, but then also protect owners and sellers' rights, because the foundation of the system was economics and money. And this is what the entire antebellum South revolved around. So it's very difficult to listen to, very difficult to hear, but it's important for us to continue to study these lessons in these cases. So again, If you've lasted 10 minutes on this video, please like, subscribe, share. Let's see if we can't get more people involved in the study of antebellum slave law, slave cases, because they are still relevant today, especially in the world in which we live, and how the antebellum slave laws and slave codes developed into the postbellum period and into the systemic racism that we still see within the system and we deal with today. So again, thanks for watching.